Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd please take your seat, we'd like to get started. I know we'll be ready to go when I see those doors close, but not before. So thank you all for being so collaborative. And we got any good jokes to share? Come on, somebody must have something new. The road. Wondering why the chicken crossed the road. She has 104-degree fever. I don't think the answer was a right one. Yeah. To see Gregory Peck. Oh my God, that's a great one. Indeed. Ooh, ba-dum-bum. The doors are beginning to close, so I think we are getting close. All right. Well, thank you all once again. We hope you've enjoyed the time together in the break and during lunch to connect up with each other, and appreciate you staying for the very long first day of the seminar. So now, once again, following the theme throughout the day as we open up each one of these panels, I'd like to ask you to enjoy this other video from our presenting sponsor, NOAA, on the 50th anniversary of Sea Grant and its efforts using locally based and applied research, outreach, education, environmental literacy, and workforce development to positively impact coastal communities. Just ask any of the Canals Fellows around this room, probably, DC or across the nation and the world, and you'll know how important this is. So, please cue the video.
For 50 years, Sea Grant has sustained the vitality of the nation's coastal resources. It has promoted economic development. It has fostered stewardship of marine habitat. Through research, education, and extension at 33 university programs, NOAA's National Sea Grant College program solves complex coastal problems for citizens, businesses, and local governments. Sea Grant, science serving America's coasts.
Great. Thank you to the Sea Grant program. Looks like we have some Sea Grant. Right. Thank you all in the front rows. All right. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to Sea Grant and to NOAA for your support. This session now with our esteemed panel right here on the stage will focus on the need to expand the ocean community, to ask ourselves how we can create opportunities and an environment of and to empower inclusion, and to empower more Americans to strengthen the ocean movement, to address all the critical issues we've heard today and will continue to hear in the next few days. Our moderator for this session is the one and only Darryl Fears, a reporter for the Washington Post. He covers environment publishing pieces on wildlife protections, thank God for the recent climate change agreements, and the Chesapeake Bay. Darryl has also been a leader writing on the issue of diversity in environmental issues, and we are delighted to thank you very much for the discussion today. Thank you very much, Darryl.
So I'm honored this afternoon to sit in the company of 4 outliers in the field of the environment, each mavericks in their own way. They include a top-ranking African-American at NOAA, Secretary Manson Brown, 2 self-starting, Latino activists who built organizations from the ground up to recruit people like them, Marce Gutiérrez, and I'm going to butcher this last name, Graudiņš. Is that close enough? And José González, and a young diver with a purpose, Rachel Stewart, and who aspires to be a role model for recruiting people like her into this movement. According to what I've gleaned from their biographies and from quietly making a few phone calls here and there, we have an observation in common. Here's mine. When I started covering environmental issues 6 years ago, I was struck by the lack of presence of people of color in every room I entered. not just African Americans like myself, but few Latinos, Asians, Native Americans. And yet, so many environmental issues impacted these groups. I wrote stories about it, quizzed people in the field about it, delved into the history of the non-white environmental justice movement, and I'm still confused. Today, our panelists are going to help me, and you maybe, get straightened out. My role is to get them talking about why the field lacks diversity, what's at stake for communities of color, how they inspired to become advocates for, I didn't think this through, ocean, and what they were doing to get others interested and build on their presence. My role calls on me to be rude, occasionally to cut them off, but I'll try to be very nice about it if and when that happens. And let's get started. Secretary Brown, you're a leader in the federal government's vanguard agency for ocean protection. An African American raised in Washington, D.C., does the staff of NOAA look even remotely like the city you grew up in? If not, why? Has increasing diversity ever been a goal there, or is their very notion frowned upon?
That's a great question, Darryl. Thanks. And thanks for hosting us for this. I tend to be frank. I tend to be frank, and as a Senate-confirmed political appointee, I can afford to be frank. So let me just be frank. When I showed up at NOAA, there was an interesting phenomenon that developed. I had a line of underrepresented employees out my door because that looked like craving for someone that looked like them and could relate to their issues. And as I went through conversation by conversation by conversation, it was clear to me that despite over the years, in this diversity and inclusion campaign that we've been in as a nation for the better part of a generation, it had not quite taken. And so I will just tell you, the demographics, particularly at the senior levels of NOAA leadership, are not what they should be. They do not reflect the diversity of this rich population. Shortly after I arrived, I asked Dr. Catherine Sullivan, what were we doing about this? And she said, what do you suggest? And we've stepped through a number of things which I can get to later. But the bottom line is we've decided as an agency, because of the uncomfortable nature of this topic, that it takes top leadership support to move the needle forward. And we've done that. We've got a commitment from each of the 140 senior executives in the agency. We've rolled our sleeves up. Our people know it. We've articulated our personal commitment to our people, and we're moving out smartly. So I expect, as we change the climate and culture, and it takes years to do that, that the demographics will improve over time.
A little later. Okay, and I'll follow up on that a little later. Marcella, you said in a document called the Verde Paper that your transition from catching fish to protecting them took a great deal of soul searching, and I found myself wondering where that search took you. Into activism, you said your launching into activism with mainstream groups wasn't always pretty. Even efforts by green groups to engage members of your community were led by non-white Latinos with no Spanish language materials. I read that with a blank stare. How did some of those things make you feel? And what steps are you taking to change perspectives among the groups and members of your community? It's a long question.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for the invitation. But frustrated, in a word, frustrated, because in the end, I am part of this ocean conservation effort, and I come from it from a very personal conversion, I like to say. I found the environment. You know, I was doing, I used to sell fish, now I save them. I worked for a commercial fishing company for about 8 years, and you know, it was coming face to face with overfishing, of trying to find, you know, hundreds of tons of feed every day, et cetera, and that was so something that's very deep and personal to me. And when I started working in the environmental field, even though I was working with a fairly diverse colleagues here at Wild Coast. Outside of that, it was very, very, as I like to say, monochromatic. So it's frustrating because we all care about the ocean, we all care about protecting it, and of a few people, you're one of a few people at the table or at the conversation, and you see these efforts about diversifying, and usually it's about translating one thing or hiring someone with no real resources and space to do any change. I'm ignoring, and at the same time ignoring the same voices that are talking about, you're at the table, they're asking how to engage Latinos, and half of the time it's more about, honestly, just expecting a stamping of what people already agreed on. We have a plan, and half of the time when it comes to people of color, groups of color, other folks, there's no space to move it. There's no space to even talk about what those goals are. There's already a plan. This is how it's, and we're probably, if you don't quite like it, then we're probably not even going to engage with you and just kind of go around it. So it's frustrating because I see what the problem is, and I see how that gets undercut, and I see how it undercuts our efforts, which I find to be laudable and authentic, but we play into the game of those that are against conservation.
Okay. That was very diplomatic.
starting off there.
The paper was a bit more frank. I would read it. Jose, feel free to pick up where Marcela left off, but I'm curious about something. When I wrote about the lack of diversity among green groups, the leaders of environmental justice organizations across ethnicities talked about a common and daunting obstacle: funding. Many said foundations simply favored larger groups because of long-standing relationships, and dozens competed for the last sliver of smaller environmental justice groups competed for the last sliver of pie. Looking at your website, Latino Outdoors, it seemed that there were volunteers and workers everywhere, east, west, mountain. And I'm wondering how you pulled this off. What is your relationship with funders like?
Another good 2 to 3 part question there. I do want to add a comment to what Marce said. It's like if you're not the right Latino, then there's always the issue that we're just going to find another Latino, and that's a big problem because they look for cracks in solidarity.
What's the right Latino?
Right, Latino. Good question. So with that, I would say understand and appreciate and respect the diversity of the Latino community, but know that there is a common approach and understanding about valuing environmental issues and conservation at large. You can look at the variety of polls and surveys that have come out over the past 3, 5, 6 years. What do they consistently say? Regardless of the type of Latino community, overwhelming support for any type of conservation. So how do you match that with this narrative of like, why aren't we engaging enough, diverse communities, or maybe why don't they care? It's like, well, you have the numbers telling you one thing. So maybe if you look at your approach and what you're doing, that's a different thing. The question isn't why aren't there more, right, diverse communities engaged in this? It's really what are we doing as a conservation community that we're not being over how we're doing the invitation, providing the resources. And I think of inclusivity as what does an actual invitation and welcome look like? Does it look like we know what we want to do, we just need you on the team, versus we have an idea of what we want to do, or here's the problem, we really could use and value your expertise, and we have resources that we want to invest because we understand there's been an equity in the approach to doing this work. Very few people the other way around approach that way. It's usually the other way around, which might be like a connecting funding, a trickle, you might have heard this phrase, trickle-down community engagement. It's just going to be easier to give the $500,000 grant to this big organization. You have this long-standing manage it, or you have this long-standing relationship. Pick your preference and bias. And then that organization is going to go find the grassroots organization, say, here's $5,000, can you help us do community engagement, for which we got $500,000. But you're going to do this out of the goodness of the community, right? Because you care about this, you're passionate, it connects to, you're excited about this. It's like, well, there's a mismatch right there. And so if you have resources, when we tell a funder, partner, whatnot, would this look different if you were going to hire a business consultant, if you're going to develop a business plan, if you don't even question what it costs, background or consultant of another background or skin color. But all of a sudden, when it comes to diversity, it gets confusing. You don't value the skill set that comes with community engagement and relationship. So that's why when we look at Latino Outdoors, they're volunteers. They love doing this. They want to be part of something. It's that craving, right? But don't take that or undervalue that for thinking that we would just want to do it for free in comparison to how you invest in other work and in other campaigns. Because we happily know how to, you have an infrastructure funding. We still have an infrastructure to build, but you can't come to the grassroots community and have a double standard of asking us to do what larger established organizations done, because you've invested in their infrastructure for decades. And now you're expecting us to just start at the same go.
So the difference between being a contributor and an afterthought. Last but not least, the future. Rachel, Stewart. So I hear you've got a cool adventure coming up, and everyone should know about this. Rachel's going to assist the expedition looking for the Guerrero. And as I flip pages, staple was a really bad idea. The pirate ship that was pursued by the British until it struck rocks on the southern Florida coast and fell apart with hundreds of slaves aboard. Rachel will be diving to help that group. This is a result of your combining an interest in engineering with diving. What drives you? How many people do you meet as you go along your way who have similar interests to yours, people like you? Do you feel an obligation to be an ambassador to draw more minorities into the field where they are largely invisible? Or do you believe that at 2016, that burden is unfair? Do you ever ask, why haven't my parents' generation worked this out by now?
Well, to answer the first question, my motivation, growing up, I've always loved being in and around water. I've always loved going to the lake. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, so landlocked. I saw the ocean just during vacation, which I was very fortunate to take on every year with my family. But I've always loved water. I wanted to preserve it. I've always seen the importance in it. So that's my driving force and why I'm so interested in diving in the ocean. When going about my day, or going about just every day meeting people and telling them about my experiences in diving, they're always interested in wondering, question why, how do I do, how am I involved in the organizations I am. They're always confused because I'm from Nashville, landlocked. They're not used to seeing the ocean, especially an African-American girl who's a scuba diver and swim and loves being in water. But I try my best to, I think I like to have that responsibility of interesting other people and educating other people of what I do and why it's important. And I enjoy being a part of this conversation and bringing other people into the ocean world and the conservation efforts.
Okay, and we'll talk later about how you do that. So far we've got 3 questions from wherever questions come from. One is a declaration. It is like a statement, so we're gonna put that one here. Although it's a good statement, it's wonderful. But here's one. NOAA surveys have found that the one group of Americans that consumes the highest level of seafood at all income levels is African Americans. I'd like to see that survey, because a lot of people eat fish. What could be the potential impact of targeting the African American community with messaging about seeking out sustainability in harvested seafood? And not only that, but let me build on that. And either of you can take this question. I'm looking at you, Manson, but anybody can take this question. And what we found with green groups and climate, climate is that green groups are preaching to the choir, basically. And so there's a broad group out there that can be reached out to, minorities who are now like 36% of the country, and that's not happening. So with this question in mind, seafood and outreach.
So, this notion of diversity and inclusion, when we look through the lens of federal programs, we do precisely what José does. We express one size fits all. And if you don't quite fit, then you don't get the full advantage of that program. I think as we really wrap our brains around this challenge, we've got to get more nuanced about this and do exactly what José said. Get into the minds of the folks that we're trying to engage, that we're trying to express. One of the things one of the things I've learned in my experience is if you're not engaging the folks that you're seeking to provide opportunity to, you only have half the engagement. And so I think engagement, understanding the root of those statistics that you just quoted, the solutions will fall out from the engagement.
Yeah, because there's overfishing of a food that we all enjoy and we need for protein, especially along the coast and especially African American communities. Anyone else want to try that? I mean, I understand that the survey that someone quoted, it said that African Americans consume the highest level of seafood, and that may be true, but all groups consume copious levels of seafood. So do that communities. And so, do you want to tackle that?
I would first say that the question assumes that African American communities don't know about sustainability, which we don't know. We're not sure, right? Who is there? Are they something? Are they quoting somewhere that says, you know, this poll says that they don't? No. So it's a false start, I think, because just because communities of color don't do sustainability or don't do their work exactly the way that the mainstream doesn't mean that they're not doing it. So just because you don't see it doesn't mean that you need to teach people. And I would really caution us to not assume that people need to be taught and need to be told how to do things, because half of the time, if not more, it could be the other way around.
Quickly, anyone else?
Oh, let me maybe give a specific example. So I was with a group in the Desert Museum over by Tucson, right? And at the Desert Museum, they have this exhibit on Baja California, so some of the estuaries and some of the, so it's this ocean exhibit at the Desert Museum. And so we took a minute to be like, wait, why is that the case? And then we got the explanation. But three pieces that made that really resonate is, one is the individual that was guiding our small group of about 5 people was a Latino. He came out of his way. He knew we were in the area. He's like, I'm going to give you a personal tour. Already we were hooked in. And the individuals that I was going with were other community leaders who, Barrio Sustain Tucson, doing barrio sustainability projects and programs. This is Tierra y Libertad, Land and Liberty. In Tucson, you know, they're doing aquaculture. They're doing everything that you would see or expect out of any traditional conservation community, but with a barrio twist. And if you're wondering what the heck is barrio, that's part of the work initiative right there, right? That's their community. And so that's important because different pieces were coming together, whereas they were understanding how not taking care of the mangroves, not being attentive to coral reef preservation, and all of a sudden they're like, you know, they're like rats. We need to be more careful about the types of shrimp that we eat. We thought that one was cool and that one was cool, but now these are not cool either. And so there was no education program for that. It was relationship. It's around relationship, but it also engaged the knowledge of those communities already. And then that's going to go out into the other communities that those leaders are associated with. Yes, we still need other resources and programs and whatnot, but a key thing there that I want to stress is that it's so crucial. Valuing and building is so crucial, and I think it is often undervalued in this work, especially when you're talking about diversity and inclusion.
Okay. Along those same lines, Marcella, a great question from the audience, I presume. Without diversity being represented at high-level positions, how can we have a progressive path to showcase qualified, diverse individuals? You got that? You got that?
Well,
you next. You follow up that up.
I mean, we can't. We as a progressive liberal or federal movement, you know, I sometimes say that the hardest conversations I have about diversity are with well-meaning liberal folks, because people assume that there's nothing to learn, that, you know, I can't be biased or prejudiced because I have really good intentions. My actions or lack thereof may affect people you know. So I think you can't, and I think that you miss out on opportunities and wins, and you expose yourself to, again, you give way to others that are against conservation to sometimes use that lack of diversity as an excuse to advance their anti-conservation agenda. And this is, you know, this is unnerving to me, because places like California, you'll have someone that comes and says, well, climate, you can't do, going into climate, but you can't do, you know, this particular climate law because farm workers are against it and blah, 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 and this and that. Well, not really. I can tell you that, you know, my grandfather was a bracero, and he died of pesticide pollution. So, you know, he wouldn't have been against environmental protections, right? But because there's nobody really to counter that from that community one-on-one, you're missing opportunities, you're opening yourself up for attacks and for effective and efficient attacks. So going back to leadership, when you have leaders that have the access and the resources to pursue these things, you advance your movement and you advance the wins.
You want to follow up on that, Manson?
I do. When I think about this dynamic, I mean, I grew up in the Coast Guard without a bunch of senior leaders that looked like me. In 2010, I was the first African American to be promoted to 3-star. Folks ask me, how do you do that? It really comes down to an issue of trust. And it's something that the Gallup poll folks talk about. They say people don't leave bad organizations, they leave bad supervisors. And what I've found, whether you're a pioneer looking up or you're a supervisor looking down, is you've got to work sort of the trust piece. When I came out of the inner city in Washington, D.C. and joined the U.S. Coast Guard, I was operating from a didn't look like trust. If you didn't look like me, I distrusted you until you proved that you were trustworthy. Quite frankly, for most of my early career, that was a limit. It wasn't until I accumulated enough experience with majority male bosses and got to a place of trust that the dynamic flipped to where we started from a place of trust until you proved yourself to be untrustworthy. And so I think we've got to play that human dynamic out within the ocean movement, because that's really what tends to hold us back. And so my bottom line here is that we don't need to start from a place where senior leadership is diverse. We just need to get to supervisors and senior leaders to understand that trust deficit and work more from their angle, understanding the perspective of those that are coming up.
Okay. So I understand a lot of this because I'm in an industry that's not very diverse either. But it's more diverse than the green movement. That's saying something. Rachel, you're young and you're entering this field. What's it like, or what's it like to think about every staff you might enter or every authority figure you might see is probably going to be a white person who may not know a whole lot about your community? Is that daunting in any way? You know, African Americans are like anyone else. You're inspired by people in leadership positions. About this, and do you ever think about this, and do your peers think about this type of thing?
I would say it is a little daunting. It is definitely something that I look at and that I notice. Especially, I'm studying civil engineering. I recently went to a water professionals conference, and I noticed that. I noticed that I was the only, or one of a few of the only African American, especially women, in that field and in that room, and I noticed it. But in inferior, looking at it as I'm inferior, or it's something I can't do, I looked at it as a way, as inspiration to keep working hard and keep progressing and keep working hard in order to inspire other people that look like me and other women, young girls, that they also can work with hard work. You can be in a leadership position and influence other people as well.
It's not like or people of color aren't in the environmental field. I mean, we're talking internationally, Chinese, Japanese, Mexicans, Cubans, and so people are very capable of doing the work. And so I kind of I want to shift this and say, let's take this from the boardroom, so to speak, or the office, to the communities, and what responsibilities do the communities bear? Is there historical racism playing into this, or is apathy playing into this? How do you explain community engagement in this area, or the lack thereof? Or you're giving me this look, your mouth is like tight. Just come with it.
You know, when we talk about engagement, it's coming again, I'm going to guess repeat it, from we as a mainstream movement have this goal, and we are going to now go engage people, sometimes people of color, and most of the time we're assuming that they need to be told and engaged how to work exactly like we're doing. And that doesn't mean that, again, that better ways. That doesn't mean that our way as a mainstream movement is the only way. So I would say let's get rid of the notion that there's apathy, because there's not. You know, every place that I've worked in, from working class, very working class people, low-income people, to folks that people told me, no, and I've been told this, like, they're too poor to care, don't go ask them that. Just ask people, don't make assumptions. Half of the time they will surprise you. And that's why, that question of like apathy in communities, I completely disagree with it. If you have those relationships, you'll learn that the drive and the care and the action.
Groups are on the front. So often minority groups are on the front lines of this, right? And so it's hard to be apathetic. The other question is, minority groups deal with a lot of issues that have nothing to do with the environment. You're fighting battles on many fronts. And so how big a priority can environmental movements be? Wall to Mexico, talking about building a wall to Mexico, and immigrating people, and calling out black people in the audience and saying, hey, look at my African American. Yeah. So there is stuff historically that our communities have had to deal with that other communities haven't. And so how do you prioritize, how does the environment fit into that mix?
I'd like to start with that one. So maybe try to give 3 specific examples. One is, Marce and I have now some of this work for quite a while now. And there's the sense of what you're talking about, the place and responsibility of history, both in how it has excluded communities in different ways to basically say this is not your space, and now all of a sudden you should care about, right? All hands on board for climate change, for example, ocean acidification. Oh no, yeah, it's a history of like, oh no, yeah, you don't belong here. This is not for you. This is not a part for you. And at the same time that there are threads that have shown how leaders in communities of leaders and leaders of colors have led in this work. And that sense of narrative and story is important because communities know when they are being framed and excluded in a way. If I ask you to think about what is the Latino to positive, if I'm not here to positively assert myself in a way to show how this is important to me, then the wall builders get to do that for me and for others. And then you get to start to believe and even accept that Latino as an identity means new, immigrant, and lesser, rather than conservation leader, right? As first Americans, pre-Americans, just as American, incorporating many other ethnicities. And so to ask the example with that is if I were to ask all of you, if I say DDT, who's the individual that comes to mind in terms of conservation leadership? And what's the work? Rachel Carson, and rightly so. And what's the work? Silent Spring, conservation success. The banning of DDT, we save the birds and eagles and whatnot. Where does the banning of DDT, actual legal case for the banning of DDT though, where did that actually start? The farm workers. A lawsuit on behalf of 6 migrant farm workers in California through the California Rural Legal Assistance Project. Why is their story not included or as important as part of the Rachel Carson narrative? And this isn't about us saying, well, Rachel Carson isn't important. We're just saying it's additive. It isn't about either or, but why isn't that expanded? And look at all these different threads, and that's important because then our own sense of history and leadership and connect roots has deeper roots. And so the last piece I'll add to that is still present in the way that I think this question about qualified, competent community leaders, both in the grassroots all the way up to management. You know, I'll give a shout out to Green 2.0 report that clearly illustrates, you know, this discrepancy there. And I tried applying for a conservation job right before starting Latino Outdoors. I didn't get hired without even a response as to why. So I said, all right, screw it. I'm going to start Latino Outdoors because this is kind of what I want to do. A couple months later, I get a call from this very same organization, a consultant saying, you've been identified as a leader in this field, and we would love to have your input and feedback. We want to pick your brain as to how we can do basically the job for which I had applied. So I was frank as well. You know, there's
It's very good. You can't name that organization, but anyway. So someone asked, how are you measuring progress on diversity and inclusion before my panel comments, I'm like, you don't need a long yardstick for that one. That's what we're here talking about. It is almost absent. I can say just from personal observation and reporting that it's just not there. And I can say from other reporting and calling up minorities who work in the field that they feel intimidated, isolated, treated as if the feedback that does not matter. That is the feedback that I get is raw. So there are some who are very engaged, but they're dispirited. So I'm just a reporter. I'm just kind of echoing what they say. But the question is, how are you measuring progress on diversity and inclusion? And I'm guessing this is a very royal you.
Okay, let me just start from a NOAA perspective. This is a great question. Thanks to Dr. Sutherland's leadership, we were able to take control of last year's senior executive, and we wrestled for NOAA, and we wrestled with this question. And what we found was that we've got an instrument that the federal government uses. It's called the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. And actually, strong elements of that really focus in on the climate and culture of your organization with regards to diversity and inclusion. There's a series of several questions that give you an indication of your inclusivity quotient. So we decided at that conference that moving the needle forward on diversity and inclusion and employee satisfaction are two sides to the same coin. FAB survey, we do this FAB survey every year. It ranks us. NASA's always first in terms of federal agencies with high employee satisfaction. NOAA's somewhere in the middle. Our senior leaders, the challenge that we put out for our senior leaders is, okay, we're in America's Environmental Intelligence Agency. We've got significant conservation responsibilities. Folks have told us that the inherent motivation for service in our agency is stronger than in any other federal agency. Why don't employee satisfaction? And so match that. And so we're embarked on raising the needle for employee satisfaction. And the theory is all ships rise together. If everybody's contributing to a very positive employee satisfaction score, then we're doing better with diversity and inclusion. Net result of this is climate and culture gets better, and we will, external to the organization, will find NOAA much more attractive.
Rachel, I know that may be a tough question for you starting out, but how will you measure progress you know, you think 5 years from now, 10 years from now, as you continue into this field?
I honestly don't know. I think besides, you know, looking in roles, but also who are in leadership roles, but also seeing in schools what students are wanting to study further and pursue as a career is a good way to see how it's progressed, seeing the interest in younger generations. And also I wanted to go back to a question that you asked earlier about how to engage communities of people of color when they're fighting other battles and there's other things that are on their mind and more pressing other than the environment. But well, I like to look at the water crisis that we're starting to see and coming to light. For example, Flint, Michigan, we're seeing more incidents like that. I like to think that, you know, all water is connected in some type of way, and so the water just in someone's backyard is going to affect the health of the ocean. So I'm a part of a program in Nashville. It's called or in high school I was, and it's called the Tennessee Aquatic Project. And a big part of that organization is community outreach and community engagement. There's a creek nearby where we meet every Saturday, or used to meet every Saturday, and we participated in a creek cleanup and a canoe access, kayak access ramp build. And while building that and using the access ramp and canoeing and kayaking, we saw a sign that said, "Don't swim in this water, don't fish from this water, don't drink this water, don't get in this water." And from that, we saw that was an issue, something that we wanted to take to our local leaders to get fixed and to get that sign taken away. So I think connecting people of color to the water at home and water resources nearby them is a good way to encourage them, especially if it's going to affect your health and things like that.
Water destroyed the Ninth Ward, right? In New Orleans, in Dallas, the floods devastated black communities there, right. As well as Flint, Michigan. Let's see. Okay, so there's a question. Since it came from the audience, I want to respect it, but I also wanted to ask something actually of my own and do that later as well, but I'll do that later. Do you feel that the Middle Passage effect influences participation of especially African Americans in ocean efforts in this country? Now, I'm going to be honest. I don't know what the Middle Passage effect is.
I was a history teacher.
Huh? Yeah, so whoever asked this question might have to explain that. Does anyone know what the Middle Passage effect is?
Right. I think what they're referring to is the Middle Passage, that route from Africa across the Americas, across the ocean, of course. And they saw going on that ship, being on that water for months, just you saw the water, and there was by because people would just jump off or be thrown into. And I think there may be superstitions, just that the ocean was just a passageway to just slavery, and there are a lot of negative effects because of that, maybe, possibly. Yeah.
Jose?
Yeah, I was going to say, I was a history teacher, so same connection in terms of the Middle Passage, meaning the transatlantic slave trade. So what does the ocean represent in terms of that historical trauma and legacy, as well as with the outdoors space in general, that I would say, around what is communicated around what is unsafe about specific outdoor spaces, and in this case, the ocean. I don't know, to be honest, in terms of the Middle Passage, but we see these narratives and threads shared around that, as commonly shared Maya Angelou's poem, these strange fruits hanging from the trees. And what have these outdoor spaces represented for communities in terms of what's safe and unsafe?
Yes, so the ecosystem being used for your destruction is frightening. you know, we don't have a white person on the panel to ask a question to, and so in these diverse conversations, sometimes when we talk about race, we don't include whiteness, and sometimes that's a problem because how do white people measure increased diversity? Is this something that in your offices you talk about? Is it something that you notice, not just us? And do you consider it a failure or do you a shrug? And so I just do wonder, so we don't have a podium or a microphone to pass around, but maybe we can just take that discussion somewhere. It's funny, I don't group stand up as a representative for the group. Although often we are called to do that. But I do, I kind of would like that question answered.
White though, right? You mean non-Hispanic white though, right?
You know, Hispanic white, exactly.
According to the census, we're very much white.
You know, that's exactly it.
That one on. Let me take that one on. You know, I was the only African American in the Coast Guard boardroom for many years, and so I think I understand many of the majority, particularly the majority male opinions about this. You know, historically, when we've talked about diversity terms, put it in sort of competitive terms, and you know, there's winners and losers, and that's most of the folks that I've worked with in my senior executive career. That's the context that many of them sort of consider. And of course, the net result is the eyes roll back, and we move on to the next. More in terms, I consider it more in terms of access. And let me just put this in an American context. You know, when I grew up in D.C., the American dream was not something that we talked a lot about. We called it what Langston Hughes used to refer to as a dream deferred. But I rode my bike around inscriptions and read all of the inscriptions on these memorials. And I believed that as a citizen, I was entitled to my shot at the dream. And so I think that's the context of diversity, and we need to talk about diversity and inclusion and get out of this, you know, one-for-one competition and talk about the notion of all ships rising together, organizational performance being better because of diversity and inclusion. That's the context that I think this conversation has to happen. But unfortunately, this word diversity is often overused, and it's become a bit of a cliche, and I think we, as an ocean community, need to work through that.
So let me be, because I've been in my business for quite some time, and I've been writing stories like this for quite some time. These conversations are so tired.
Yes, they are.
It's like, you know, Darryl come and moderate a panel about something you hear about all the time, and there's so little progress. And I am enjoying this conversation. I'm sure you guys are enjoying this conversation too. But if this goes nowhere, I would not be surprised.
That's a typical result.
Exactly. So, you know, how do you move this forward? How do you carve a figure out of this stone?
Yeah, real quickly, because it goes back to the measures of success, right? So these 4 things I would say. One is, if you're stuck on the questions of why this is important, that's a separate conversation, right? And again, I'll call out the Green 2.0 report because that has a very clear call to action. Show your numbers to start. Just show the numbers. How diverse is your organization? Because that's a starting point as a metric. It's not the only one. And second, this conversation, similarly to this, that I don't want to have this conversation 5 years from now, or 10, or 15. We missed several chances 10 years ago, 20 years ago. 1990, letter to the Big Ten from the environmental organizations to the Big Ten enviro groups. we didn't do anything back then. I don't want to see that. And then third, measure of success is, for me, continue to be more irrelevant. People sometimes struggle with that. That the conversations that we're having is because this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just a practice, but it's an actual integrated practice. It has budget items in terms of resources, but it's also integrated into all departments and practices, and also regardless of your background. Because the last piece for me is, regardless whatever brown, whatever socioeconomic background or ethnicity, you see that you have a role to responsibility and a role to play. And that's where I think this question about if you're white, do you understand and realize how you can be an ally? Do you understand that concept, and what are things you can do? Because you do have ability and power, especially to communicate with other peers of your own group, because if it's the brown guy trying to say something, there he goes again talking about diversity, right? There's already a devaluing of it, because of course he's going to be, pushing that.
So can I cut you off for a second, because you can continue on after I ask these two very provocative questions. So, the first is, you have this notion, especially in liberal communities, of color blindness. And so this question is, most whites that I know try hard to literally be colorblind. Is that reasonable? Followed by this, as second question, as a white journalist who frequently covers race and the environment, you're very rare, whoever you are, whoever wrote this, a white journalist who frequently covers race and the environment, as well as interviewing diverse leadership of all environmental issues. How do I respond to accusations of racism? Is there a positive, constructive way to respond to an acceptance or an accusation of racism, or is it, I think that's kind of not to engage. I think that's kind of a question you have to answer for yourself. But these are two very interesting questions, and you can almost pick up where you left off. She's biting her lips are tight again. So.
Well, I can close it with my statement, if that's okay. I'll just close that by saying there's a lived experience that we each have that if you haven't lived it, then you have to start with an appreciation point, right? And that's a question of privilege as well. You may have the privilege to be, I don't know, in other words, because you can operate within a mainstream narrative where, as Michael Brune, was writing for the Sierra Club, he's like, wow, I can just shut my laptop and not read all these nasty comments, and I can go and operate in the world normally. Some of us don't get that. We don't get to shut the laptop and then go out and be treated in the same way. So
we got 7 minutes.
I close it there because for me, color blindness is not good enough, because we respect and value diversity in the ecological system. We don't say that's a beautiful monoculture of a forest, or look at this, coral reef. It's all the same. That's what we want.
Well, it's almost all the same. It's just acidification.
I know. That's going to be the sad. And then it's all going to be bleached in white.
Well,
Had to throw a joke.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say, actually.
No, he said exactly what you're going to say?
Yes.
Good job.
Color blindness is privilege. The privilege to assume that color doesn't affect your life is very much something that white people have. People of color don't have that privilege. People of color don't have the most of the time to not think about race, to how people treat them, to how that affects their work, their interactions. So I understand and appreciate, this is why I meant intent, and this is why I meant before, that sometimes the hardest conversations about diversity are with well-meaning white liberal people, because...
Allies.
Well, no, let's just leave it at that.
Oh.
So from my perspective, this notion of color blindness I find objectionable because you're not valuing me as a unique contributor to the organization. And it also assumes, similar to the other speakers, that the preferences of the majority define the culture and climate and the business rules. And I also equally find that objectionable. So I don't think that attitude adds to the type of culture and climate that we're going to need in this movement to move forward with this issue.
I think that the other person, a journalist who covers race and the environment, was basically getting at comfort around this discussion. You know, it's a difficult discussion, and it makes people very uncomfortable. It makes both parties uncomfortable. You want to talk about that at all, Rachel, or does anyone ever thought about that? I'm putting you on the spot, but if you don't, you know, that's fine. But comfort around this. Anybody wants to talk about the discomfort around this conversation?
I do get a little uncomfortable talking about it. It's something I'm not sure. I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to be offended. I don't want to look have a different opinion about someone. So I think there is a little discomfort there, but it's a progress that needs to be had in order to make progress.
From my perspective, it's always been an uncomfortable discussion. You know, we're an organization that's founded on reason. When you talk about diversity and inclusion, it's really emotion. And we don't like infusing emotion into our professional lives. But this is a subject that's going to require a little passion and an emotion to work through. And what I found in my experience, it requires, particularly the majority, develop a means of getting into those so that they can get into those deeply rooted conversations to come to a higher plane of understanding and talked about linkages of trust that I talked about before. This is the reason why we always go through this sine wave. We talk about it, nothing happens. We talk about it, nothing happens. This is the reason that NOAA recognizes without top-level support and the accountability to back it up, this just isn't going to happen.
2 points. The first one is, as a colleague once says, I get to be uncomfortable all the time. Why don't you meet me halfway? Right? You get a little uncomfortable, and then I'll do that. And again, it goes back to that question of privilege. And I can understand that's hard. It is. It can really, really be hard. And hey, I also have privilege as a Latino male. But that means I can meet other people halfway around questions of gender, sexuality, other privileges that I have that others don't. So I push myself on that. And then second, going to be, for me, this question that don't lose sight of the fact that we all share a common goal, right? If you might think, oh, he might seem defensive, or maybe he's pushing too hard, or he's making me uncomfortable, I care about the same conservation successes that you do, a lot. And sometimes that gets, you know, all of a sudden, well, maybe I don't, you know, we forget that part, that we're actually want to build this together. So it's additive. But guess what? That means we have to engage in what may be feel and is perceived as uncomfortable, because that's what change in the culture is.
The discomfort may be amplified because generally there's a make balance. I mean, the person making the plea, or whatever you want to call it, is making it to an authority figure. And if that person says the wrong thing, that person can lose their job or lose their position. And so that's certainly a major discomfort other than just feeling awkward. I hope that would lead to a general more discussion. We got 1 minute left. Anybody want to say anything that we didn't talk about in 50 seconds?
I think that, first of all, you know, I said a couple of times, communities of color are interested. Communities of color are working on conservation issues. I think that we need to value communities' efforts in not measure things as how we do things as an Oreo we hear. And we need to value relationships and skills, right? So if we are trying to, we can have each Latinos, well, we can have a conversation about why, when, and how, or should, if. Start by talking to the folks that you know. How do we work on this? And, you know, do we co-create goals? Do we co-create a strategy? Or are you, you know, trying to get folks to just kind of somehow show up and be part of that? But value relationships.
I enjoyed this. I hope it created some discomfort, but I'm sure we can get past that. And thank you very much. You guys were very insightful. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm more than a little intimidated to come up on stage at this point and to have to close this conversation. It's one that we've needed and have had a long time, for a very, very long time. There is a lot of diversity in our population in this community, and some of us can hide as much of an issue, a struggle, and it's not as much of an issue as it is for others. And so I want to thank you all for helping us in our community come out of the closet, in a sense, and to take this issue head on. And I hope that with your support and help and with your contacts and colleagues and friends, we'll be able to better integrate and diversify and expand our knowledge of different approaches and work that's being done on these really important issues. So thank you very much. So maybe it was because some of the corals and people are bleaching, but we have been trending on Twitter all day long, thanks to the wit, the humor, the very smart comments and online community engagement by our online community today. So I thank those of you that are in the room that have been tweeting and posting and doing all those other things, and those of you in our online community that are really engaging and following us because you can't be here. You are part of this broader community, and we thank you for taking the time to all be. Someday we'll be able to all be in one giant room together or outside someplace together. So this is the first day of a really exciting and packed week. We have a full week ahead of us. We have certainly only begun, so please don't think your work is over. Tomorrow and Thursday we have some other exciting topics ahead, like exploring the electronic monitoring in fisheries and the advancements of technology, also debris, innovations in marine debris, Gulf restoration, offshore energy, a full host of issues. So we hope you'll be back with us tomorrow. And we gave you a break today, prepare for our big in a little bit and prepare for our big night tonight. But that's not the case tomorrow. We'll be starting bright and early at 9:30 with a session on digital tracking and enforcement of IUU fishing. So don't forget, look at your packets, check online, check into the app, make sure you know what's going on. And may I please ask you once again to join me in an amazing round of applause for our panel. Thank you all. Go out and be safe, and hopefully we'll see most of you this evening.